Hi, and welcome back to TubaPeopleTV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all the time. I'm here in Park Ridge, Illinois with Puddles and with Deborah Oberschelp. Deborah, thanks for having us into your home.
Hey, no problem.
Deborah was the orchestra acting performance coordinator of Chicago Symphony from 1982 to 1983, and then the orchestra personal manager of the Chicago Symphony from 1984 to 1995. And Deborah, you also worked in other positions prior to that with the Chicago Symphony and also the Minnesota Orchestra, is that correct?
That's right. And in 1976, I went to the Minnesota Orchestra. Stanislav Skrobaczewski was their music director. That was a mouthful.
You said it, not me.
Yeah, he was a wonderful guy who had been at the Minnesota Orchestra for almost 25 years when I got there. And then he was leaving and Neville Mariner was coming in. And when you work at the Minnesota Orchestra, it's a wonderful job, but you're in the Midwest and you're aware that that jewel of the orchestra world is 400 miles southeast. And I made it my goal to get down here somehow. And Leonard Slatkin, who was a regular director guesting at Minnesota, and I became very good friends. And he was also a regular guest conductor down here. And so he said, I'll keep my eye open for you.
Oh.
And one day he called and he said, there's a job opening at the Chicago Symphony. It's the secretary to the manager. And I came down and interviewed, and Mr. Edwards gave me a job. That was in the summer of '78. Prior to that, I had been in the wintertime down for my first concert of the Chicago Symphony. They played Berlioz, Romeo and Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard the orchestra, and I heard what a sound it was in Orchestra Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And it was rather life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
The Minnesota Orchestra was wonderful. I would never take anything away from them. It's a great orchestra to this day. But the Chicago Symphony was very special, and there was nothing quite like it. And my dream came true.
I remember you mentioned once that a concert that you heard of the orchestra was pictures and an exhibition, and you were mentioning something about the sound of the brass.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was something about the trumpet that was indescribable. The playing by Bud, I'm just a lay person. I'm not a professional musician, but I'm a good listener, and the sound that he has is legendary. I understand that, but there's a clarity to his playing and a self-assuredness to his playing. And when you grow up in high school bands and orchestras, and there are constant misses and skips in all sections, you kind of get used to that. And when you hear a concert for the first time where it's all perfect,
Mm-hmm.
everything is not only played flawlessly, but with such beauty, you're just blown over. You can't believe that this is possible. And that's what it was like to hear the Chicago Symphony, and particularly with the pictures with Bud. And it was in, I guess, 1990, I think I mentioned this to you the other day, where I was at a concert in Japan, and Bud played the pictures, and I was lucky enough to have my mother with me on that tour. She was sitting with me, and at the end of the concert we were applauding, of course, and we were looking at each other, and out of the corner of my eye I saw Bud's son Steve sitting a few seats down, and he was dissolved in tears.
Oh.
And it was very touching. I'll never forget that moment, because here I was with my mom, and there he was listening to his dad.
Yeah.
So proud, so moved. And that was my reaction very often to Chicago Symphony concerts over many, many years, one of just profound emotional responses to the playing of this great orchestra. And I was very, very fortunate to be part of it for a little while.
Well, more than a little while. And Deborah does have a degree in music, so she is a musician. So don't want to undersell yourself. Now you mentioned I remember when I worked for the Chicago Symphony in backstage duties. There was a tour to Japan in 1986 also, and so the orchestra went to Japan. You were there, obviously. I didn't go. I was just a behind-the-scenes person, but you were a very important person in the structure of the Chicago Symphony. Can you tell me what that was? We're talking a little bit about Bud. Bud and Jacobs are often referred to as the bookends of the brass section of the Chicago Symphony, and really bookends in orchestral brass sounds. They've been given that title for some time now. What was that like?
Well, that's a good description. And one of the things about touring is it opens up yet another world, international touring in particular. So my memories of Arnold Jacobs are that he was not for me so much of a bookend, but an anchor. He was the bottom layer there that was the anchor and the foundation. And he was a kind person to me. You know, it's legendary that artists of all stripes have various temperaments. But Arnold Jacobs was always kind to me, and I remember that so well. I felt that he was an interesting man. I had heard about his studio in the Fine Arts Building, and that he had a following. Now, most of the musicians taught privately, but there was something a little bit more legendary about his teaching because he was known for his singular way of teaching and some of his theories, etc. But I didn't really grasp the effect of this until we went abroad. So my first trip abroad with the orchestra was in 1985. We went to Europe in January. And I started getting a little hint of what Arnold Jacobs and Bud Herseth were like to the rest of the world. Probably we're talking the rest of the brass world,
Right.
but in their own ways to the world, musical world. And it started to occur to me that there was something really special about these two guys in particular, because in Europe there were so many people who wanted to see them and wanted to visit with them backstage, etc. Then that was dialed up tenfold when we went to Japan. So my first trip to Japan in 1986, the first concert was at the Bunka-Kaikan. And this is a big, massive hall in a city park in Tokyo. And we went to and did the concert, and as we were coming out, I couldn't get to the bus because there were so many people. There was this crush of people there, and they were trying to see Arnold Jacobs and Bud Herseth and get their autograph and see them and touch them and visit with them. And again, not to take away anything from the rest of the orchestra, certainly Dale Clevenger and many other people, Ray Still, were famous around the world.
Yeah.
And they were well known. I don't want to take away anything from anybody in the orchestra. They were all famous in their own way. But in particular, it was Arnold Jacobs and Bud Herseth that there was this crush, this mad crush of people to see those two figures. And so it was obvious at that moment to me that Arnold Jacobs and Bud Herseth were the rock stars of the brass world, of the symphonic brass world.
What an experience. What a great experience that must have been.
Yeah, it was. It was so eye-opening.
Yeah.
And the musicians themselves interacting with the people in Japan, it was marvelous. And both Jake and Bud made supreme efforts to relate to the young students over there, to have workshops, master classes, and be with them as much as they could.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie, for this this little behind the stage scenes look.
My pleasure.
At a couple of very important and legendary people in music in general and brass playing in particular. As is always the case, Puddles always reminds me that we need to observe certain decorum, And he had heard that you and your husband Wayne are big barbecue fans.
Mm-hmm.
And so he instructed me to bring to you a bottle of genuine University of Oregon duck barbecue sauce, the raspberry chipotle variety. And so Puddles would like you to have this.
Well, from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you, and we thank Puddles. I think I'll put this right there so that these two O's can be together, and I'm thinking of Oberschelp, and
Yeah.
I'm particularly touched that he wore that today.
Well, he was thinking of you.
I think so.
It doesn't happen often, but he did this time. So. All right. Thank you very much, Debbie.
Thank you, Mike.
Now back to you.